Hi guys, welcome back. So in this video we are going to talk about the renewable resources fisheries. Remember in the last section we were talking about depletable resources. Now we will move to the renewable resources. There are many types of renewable resources, and in this video we will focus on fisheries. Biologists consider some renewable resources are inexhaustible. For example, some greater sea fisheries. But is that true? Think about the Atlantic cod. It is a long-lived, slow-to-mature species, and once abundant, the clan was one could walk from Spain to New World on their backs, and it is very important in feeding the world. But let's see the number of U.S. Atlantic cod since 1950s. We can see the number of U.S. Atlantic cod is decreasing after 1980s. So what happened during this period? Suppose the green line on this graph represents the number of fishes caught, and the orange line represents humans' fishing effort to catch fishes. So as we can see, the fishing effort is increasing over time. Why? Because the number of boats is increasing, the size of boats is also increasing. And with the more advanced technology, we can catch more fishes. But there is no more fish being caught. Why? I think it is a sign that the population of fish is declining, because the number of fish caught is almost constant, right? But the fishing effort is increasing. The only reason we can get this graph is that the population is declining. And let's see another example. This graph represents the relationship between the stock of herrings and the time. So as we can see, the stock of herrings is decreasing after 1966, right? After 1966, and North Sea herring ban started in 1977. But at this point, the stock of herring was almost zero. So that means fish stock is depleted even before the policy intervention. What causes the race to fish? There are so many reasons, like human greed, myopic behavior, overcapitalization. Also, the more advanced technology help us to catch more fish, and there is lack of well-defined property rights. Too many people chasing too few fish. All those reasons causes the race to fish problem. And we also call this kind of problem the tragedy of the commons. That is defined as, under open access, every individual has an incentive to extract the resource up to the point where the average revenue is equal to average costs. However, when we reach average revenue is equal to average costs, this point is not an efficient allocation, because at this point there is zero surplus. The difference between revenue and costs is zero, right? There's zero surplus. The efficient allocation is achieved when we have marginal benefits is equal to marginal costs. Then the difference between total benefits and total costs would be maximized. So under open access, where each individual has an incentive to extract the resource as much as they can, then we cannot reach the optimal level of allocation. So why does this happen? Let's see this graph to understand why does that happen. The green line represents the marginal benefits curve. The black line represents the average benefits curve, and the red line represents the marginal cost curve. So the efficient level of allocation is achieved when we have marginal benefits is equal to marginal cost curve, right? So Q star is our efficient quantity. However, under open access, every individual has an incentive to use up as much of the resource, otherwise someone else will use. And that also means open access outcome is achieved where average costs are equal to average benefits. Why? Because if average benefits are greater than average costs, then there would still be incentive to enter the market until the quantity is increased and the average benefits are equal to average costs. There is zero profit. And if the average costs are greater than average benefits, that means the total profit is negative, right? And someone would leave the market until the Q is decreased and the average benefits are equal to average costs again. So this point is our open access equilibrium. Then we are going to talk about another concept, bioeconomics. It means biology and economics. Biological system is dynamically affected by human behavior, and in this video, fish population is dynamically affected by fishing. And Gordon said that overfishing was the result of no economic rent for things in the sea. Or we can say the overfishing problem was due to no property rights, because as we talk about in this open access problem, everyone would have incentive to use up as much of the resource until we have average benefits are equal to average costs. So that is overfishing problem. Then let us go through the basic fishery biology. Here are two graphs. The first one represents the relationship between fish population and time, and the second graph represents growth rate and fish population. And I split each graph into 3 sections. For the first one and the third one, I called those two the slow growth section, and for the middle one, I call this the fast growth section. So for the slow growth, that means birth is slightly above death, and for the fast growth, that means birth is dramatically greater than death. And when we have birth is slightly above death, what we can say is that the population is increasing. However, not so much. The growth rate is increasing smoothly, right? When the birth is dramatically greater than death, we can say the population is dramatically increasing. So that is what I mean, the slow growth and fast growth. Another concept I want to cover is carrying capacity. That is defined as the natural ability of the environment to maintain a stock of fish. And another perspective to understand those two graphs is to start from the second one. As we can see from the second one, the growth rate is always positive, right? It increases at first, and at the top point, after the top point, it decreases, but it is always positive. And then with the positive growth rate, we come back to the first graph. Because the growth rate is always positive, that implies the population would always increase. The only difference between the first section and the second section is to grow with a slow growth rate or a higher growth rate. And here is the same graph as we talked here. And we also call this one the Schaefer model. It shows the relationship between the growth of fish population and the stock of fish. And here I highlight 2 points. This one, S and K. S represents the minimum viable population, and it is defined as a critical minimum population that must be maintained for survival. And for this one, K, carrying capacity, it is the natural ability of the environment to maintain a stock of fish. So why I call the minimum viable population is the level must be maintained for survival. As we can see, if the stock level is less than S and greater than 0, then the growth rate would be negative. And that also means the fish stock would decrease until it achieves 0. And only if the fish stock is greater than S, then our growth rate would be positive. Then the environment can maintain a certain level of fish stock. And if the fish stock is greater than S, we can say the growth rate is positive, right? So that also means the fish stock would continue to increase until it reaches a certain level, K. And we can also see from this graph, at certain level K, the growth rate becomes 0 again. That means the fish stock would stop increasing, right? And that is where the definition of carrying capacity comes from. Then we are going to talk about the 2 equilibriums on the graph. They are called unstable equilibrium and stable equilibrium, depending on whether the population will come back to steady state after small deviation. And the steady state is defined as a state of no change. That is, the amount of fish stock and the catch remains constant across time, or when the catch is just equal to the growth in population. So come back to our stable and unstable equilibrium. We first define the stable equilibrium as a level of stock that will be restored following temporary shocks. So what does that mean? Suppose there is a shock to decrease the fish stock until this level. So at this level, we can see the growth rate is still positive, right? So that means the fish stock would continue to increase until it reaches K, because at level K, the growth rate becomes 0 again. Or we can say the birth is equal to death. So the fish stock is constant and the growth rate is also constant. That is one steady state. Then we are going to talk about unstable equilibrium, defined as a level of stock that will be deviated following temporary shocks. So suppose we start from this level and there is a positive shock, increase the fish stock to this level. So we can say at this level the corresponding growth rate is positive. That means the fish stock would continue to increase. So that is what I mean, deviate from the original level. And suppose there is a negative temporary shock to decrease the fish stock to this level, anywhere between 0 and S. So we can see anywhere between 0 and S, the growth rate is negative, right? So the growth rate is negative means the fish stock would decrease until it reaches 0. And that also explains when there is a negative temporary shock, we would also deviate from this unstable equilibrium. So from those 2 aspects, I explain why this equilibrium is unstable and why this equilibrium is stable. Come back to our steady state. An example of steady state would be that a population stabilizes when the flow of births exactly equals the flow of deaths, then the amount of population and the catch remains constant across time. We can also use a little terminology to explain the steady state. Remember, the steady state is a state of no change. The amount of fish stock and the catch remains constant across time. So across time, remember here. So we use X to represent fish stock. We use H to represent amount of fish harvested at a given time. So according to steady state, the amount of fish in time period T would be equal to the amount of fish in time period T minus 1, right? And this meaningful equation tells us that the fish stock at time t is depending on the fish stock at time t minus 1, and the fish growth and also the amount of fish harvested. So if we want to reach stock at time t equals to stock at time t1, that means we need to equalize those two terms, growth and harvest. That also means we need to catch the same amount that it will grow to achieve this state, steady state. So the next concept is sustainable. It is defined a catch level equal to the growth rate, and the maximum sustainable yield is the max catch that can be harvested in every period in perpetuity. And every point on the growth curve represents a sustainable yield, right? Because every point represents the growth rate, and if we harvest just at the growth rate, our harvest rate is just equal to the growth rate, then we can achieve the sustainable yield, and the maximum amount we can achieve is at this level. Because the growth rate is maximized, which also means the amount that we can harvest is also maximized. And here I have a question. Do you think harvesting at the MSY is maximum sustainable yield, is always efficient? The answer is no, however. Though the amount is maximized, however, it is not the efficient level that we can harvest. And let's bring in some economics to explain this question. Why harvesting at the MSY is not efficient? Here are three assumptions that we want to make at first. The first one, the price of fish is constant due to perfect market competition. And the second one, the marginal cost of a unit fishing effort is constant. The third one, amount of fish caught per unit of effort is proportional to stock. That means when there is more fish, per unit of effort gives more catch. Then we can think of this problem in terms of effort rather than fish stock, because we assume the amount of fish caught per unit of effort is proportional to stock. So we just use effort to represent our fish stock, and we are still thinking about sustainable yields. Then we get a graph represents the relationship between harvest and effort. Remember, at a steady state, harvest should be equal to the net growth in population, and we use x-axis to represent effort, and we also use effort to represent the fish stock, because according to our third assumption, the amount of fish caught per unit of effort is proportional to stock. So from this graph, we say that yield is proportional to stock and effort, and at this point, we get the maximum sustainable yield, which is represented by MSY. Then we go ahead to define the fishing effort. It is a measure of harvest intensity. and it depends on the harvest time scale, the fishery itself, and the heterogeneity of gill and scale. So here are some examples of effort units. For example, the number of vessels, the number of fishing trips, the length of each trip, and fishing power, and also our technology. So a combination of the above can measure the harvest intensity, or we can see can measure the fishing effort. So where do we catch? So from the economics perspective, we need to catch at the efficient level, right? So the efficient level is achieved when we have marginal benefits of catch is equal to marginal costs of catch. So why we need this condition to achieve the efficient level of catch? Because at this level, the net benefit, or we can say the profit we can get from catch, is maximized. And from this graph, the net benefit is maximized at this level, E star. The difference between total benefits and total costs is maximized. Also, we can see at this level, E star, the marginal benefits is this line, is the slope of total benefits, right? So the marginal benefits at this point, which should be equal to this line, this dashed line, and the marginal cost is just the slope of total cost curve, and at this point the marginal benefit is equal to marginal cost. Then we can say at E star the net benefit is maximized. So what does that mean? That means our efficient level of fish catch E star is not equal to our MSY, maximal sustainability yield level, EMSY, and it is clearly from this graph that E star is more efficient because the net benefit is greater than we can get at this level. The difference between total benefits and total costs at this level would be greater than the difference we can get at EMSY. So we can say do not harvest at the maximum sustainability yield. And our economic efficiency can also lead to more conservation because at this level, E star, we just harvest less and we maintain more fish stock. Then let's think about the open access problem. But in this example, we are talking about the cattle rather than the fish. The efficient level of cattle on the pasture is Q star, which is decided by letting marginal benefits equal to marginal costs. So we can say the intersection is here and the corresponding quantity is Q star. But under open access, every individual has an incentive to use up as much of the resource. Otherwise, someone else will use. An open access outcome is decided where average costs are equal to average benefits. And at this point, we get the intersection of average benefits and average costs, where the difference between benefits and costs would be 0 at this point. And we are going to do a multiple question. Where is the open access point on this graph? So there are 4 options, A, B, C, D, and the open access outcome is C, because under open access, everyone would enter this market until there is no profits, and no profits is achieved when we have total costs are equal to total benefits. Then the difference between those two terms would be 0, and 0 just means no profits. Then we go back to the open access fishery. Economic inefficiency is achieved under open access because the present value of net benefits are not maximized. Why? because fish are not paid anything for their input in the production process, and there is a market for fish, but not for the scarcity of fish. And in this slide, I introduced the 4 ways to correct this problem. Command and control, market-based instrument, creating property rights, collectively management. And the first 2, command and control and market-based instrument, are very similar to the method we used to control the pollution. First, the command and control, we can control the vessel and gear restriction. We can put vessel and gear restriction. For example, we can restrict the type of vessel, the vessel length, and second, time restriction. We can impose seasonal closures, the season length to catch fish. The third one is total allowable catch. No fishing after a certain amount is retrieved. And the last one is called marine protection. It is a spatial closure to allow populations to breed or recover. However, by using command and control method, we get some unintended effects. See this graph, the left y-axis represents number of vessels, and the right y-axis represents season length. The x-axis represents year. So the government wants to restrict the season length to restrict the number of fish harvested. However, at the same time, the number of vessels just increased because of this command and control method. So that also means the government's final objective was not achieved due to these unintended effects. And in this slide, I talk about some problems with command and control method. For example, it may be inefficient due to increased costs, and it may have some unintended effects, like for time restriction method, there may be more vessels and more intensive fishing. For total allowable catch, fish may disappear sooner, and for protected areas, it means more fish in non-protected areas. So in this graph, I talk about the effect of regulation. TC1 just represents total cost in an unregulated fishery, and TC2 represents total cost of command and control were imposed. So due to the command and control regulation, fishermen were forced to produce in a more expensive way. So at this point, we can say there is additional capital and labor represent on the source of waste. So the command and control method just increased the cost of input. So the second way we can achieve maximum sustainability economic yield is market-based instrument. And there are 2 types of market-based instruments. The first one is tax, and the second one is called individual transferable quota. The first one, tax, which is very similar to the example we talked about in the environmental control video. So remember, in that video we used tax to achieve the efficient level of pollution, and the efficient point is achieved when the marginal abatement cost is equal to tax, right? So the logic here is very similar to the logic in that video or in that lecture notes. So the second method is individual transferable quota, which is also very similar to the environmental control problem. But here we just called this quota rather than permits. Similar to pollution permit, quota entitling a holder to a certain share of total catch of a species that can be traded, and also similar to permits, the sum of quota should equal total allowable catch, and it should be easy to trade or transfer the quota. Besides the command and control and market-based methods. There are also some other ways we can do to achieve maximum sustainability economic yield. For example, volunteer behavior. You volunteer to achieve the sustainable economic yield, and fishing cooperatives, collective management of a common property resource, social and cultural norms to ensure sustainable harvest. So if inefficient management occurs due to open access, another solution is private ownership and management. Aquaculture is the control, raising and harvesting of fish, and aquaculture of any species is based on a biological production process, and it interacts with the environment. It also involves replicating the species' life in nature and then to improve conditions to improve productivity. And this graph shows that the farmed fish share in global production has increased from 4% in 1970s to 46% in 2008. And does private farming solve the problem? However, we also have some other environmental concerns. The local problem, the regional wild problem, the global problem. So even though the private farming can solve some part of the problem, but it also introduces some other problems at a different level.